Okay, Professor. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. And on behalf of CMA Sri Lanka, let me first of all welcome you for this webinar, which is kind of different today because today we are not going to witness a presentation. Today, actually, we are going to listen to a very exciting conversation between none other than Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And of course, he'll be joined by our President, Professor Lakshmanara Vatawala, and also our Vice President, Mr. Hennaka Bandara. Dr. Vijayawardena, as you know, is the former Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and he's very keen. He's very keen on talking about the debt restructuring and also the impact of debt restructuring to the Sri Lankan society. And from CMA Sri Lanka, we have our founder president and incumbent president, Professor Lakshmanara Vatawala, and also incumbent Vice President, Mr. Hennaka Bandara, who is also the President of South Asian Federation of Accountants this time. So to start the day's proceedings, let me now invite Professor Lakshmanara Vatawala, who is an eminent professional in the field of accounting in the South Asian region, to welcome the audience. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Rujira. Today, we are having this very important webinar on the challenges beyond the debt restructuring plan and impact on society. Before we start on it, I must say that I am very thankful to Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena, a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank and one of the leading economists in Sri Lanka, for kindly accepting our invitation to be present. And he said that we should not go on the traditional mode, but let us have a conversation or discussion. And that he said that this also must be done by the president and the vice president. So I'm very thankful to you for this new concept that we have thought of. I just want to say a few words about our institute. Now, the Certified Management Accountants Institute of Sri Lanka is the national professional management accounting body in Sri Lanka. So as a national body, we are really engaged in producing management accountants who will fit into the government sector, the private sector, the industry and commerce. And today, professionals are a very important part, and they play a very important role in the economic development of Sri Lanka. Especially in today's situation, professionals have to play a leading role. I'm saying this because a lot of professionals are running out of the country. I think they should stay behind and make their contribution if we are to overcome these difficulties. Because normally, we should be able to face a situation. Now, these are things that are taught to us, these which are the practical side is given to us. So I think we should be brave. And also, I feel that we have been let down by the government side. From the private sector, we have done so many things. There are so many regulatory authorities that are looking after the private sector. I think Dr. Vijayawardena will himself know the central bank, the regulator for the banking sector, to look after the financial institutions of this country. So similarly, there are other institutions which have to be really the driving force, and the private sector would fall in line and they are able to undertake and carry on their duties. Now we have the Securities and Exchange Commission controlling all the public quoted companies. So many rules and regulations that are done. But on the other hand, you compare the state corporations, what are the rules and regulations that they are having? So the government has made a lot of mistakes, you know. The government has not used professional management. They don't have professional thinkers. So we are in this sad situation. Today we have to say this openly. Because I also have managed state corporations and made loss-making corporations profit-making institutions. So we are very sad about this current situation, but there is nothing that can be done. We have to tighten our belts. And today people have still not realized the very crisis situation or the dangerous situation that we are in. People are asking for fuel. They don't know how to control themselves. But we also have another side, the society. Now we are talking of the impact on society, the medical facilities, the food area, rising prices. So there are a lot of areas where we are having serious problems. And now that the COVID pandemic is over, we are able to now get around and try to do our best to do this. So I think these are a few things, but I must also tell you that as a national professional management accounting body, CMA has also been entrusted certain responsibilities and duties by the Act of Parliament that has set us up. Because when you say Act of Parliament, if you look at the universities, they are set up by an Act of Parliament. We are professional accounting bodies which are also set up by an Act of Parliament, but we are different. We not only do the academic side, but we also do the practical side, the practical training, which I think is the need of the hour. So, and then people who are after A-level, immediately they can join us and then complete their studies by 21, 22. Unfortunately, the universities are not following what we are doing. But we don't want to follow the universities. We do it on time. We are timely, we are professional, and we are doing it, and we are sacrificing ourselves in order to serve this country. So that's why that I was telling you about this important thing of the Cost and Management Accounting Standards Board. We have set this up in order that we can have standards for the cost and accounting area, because this is going to be very important in today's climate of the crisis situation, where we will be able to work out the costing of products. Today, that is a major problem. And I hope that everyone will be able to take this into account and also work with us so that we can help all of you all. And we are also getting the international experience of our neighboring countries like India, where we have signed MOU and they are going to help us. So those are just a few things that I thought that I should tell you. So today, I think the most important thing is on this debt restructuring plan. And we have one of the, I think, most eminent persons in Sri Lanka who will be able to speak to us. Because not only has he got the experience and the exposure, he has seen all these things. He has worked on this, not only locally, but also with the international exposure and experience that he has got. So I'm very thankful to Dr. Vijayawardena, who is there. Then on our discussion, I will also be assisted by our Vice President, Mr. Hennayaka Bandara, who will also be able to look at the regional experience, because as the president of the South Asian Federation of Accountants, now CMA, that is the other recognition that we have, the president of the South Asian Federation of Accountants, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, then of course Sri Lanka is there, then we have Maldives, we have Bhutan, Nepal, all these countries. So we are a very recognized body in this whole region. So going on to our topic, now I just want to maybe get a short introduction from Dr. Vijayawardena, because now very many times on various platforms, people have been saying that our country is now doing very well. We have now moved up from lower middle income to upper middle income, and we have maybe the GDP is up. Then our maybe the other things of where we are really doing well. But unfortunately, today we are in a very, very serious situation of a bankrupt situation. So I just want to ask Dr. Vijayawardena, that if we were doing so well, how did we come to this situation?
Thanks, Professor Vattawalla, for inviting me to share my thoughts on this important subject. The question that you have raised is that if Sri Lanka has done so well in terms of economic growth and economic development, how Sri Lanka can come to a situation like today, where we are facing a situation in which the country is nearly bankrupt. Now, about this lower middle income country status of Sri Lanka, we actually crossed the threshold of a lower middle income country in terms of the definition of the World Bank in 1997. But officially, we were recognized as a lower middle income country in year 2007 in order to provide concessionary financing for Sri Lanka. In 2019, Sri Lanka was elevated to a higher middle income country based on the country's performance in year 2018. But in 2020, we were downgraded again because we were not able to maintain that status continuously. So therefore, we were pushed down from a higher middle income country to a lower middle income country in 2020 based on our economic performance in year 2019. Now, today's situation is a very chaotic situation, Professor Watawala, because the central bank recently made a presentation to Sri Lanka's creditors of international sovereign bonds and commercial lenders and also the bilateral lenders. And in the presentation, the central bank had been working on a GDP, gross domestic product, at current market prices amounting to some 23 trillion Sri Lanka rupees in year 2022. And this is because, you know, this is a jump from, say, 16%, 16 trillion rupees in year 2021 to 23 trillion. And many might think that, you know, we had attained a super high economic growth in order to produce that amount of value. But that has happened mainly because of the high inflation. Because in the estimation of the GDP at current market prices, which includes the increases in the price level, the central bank has incorporated some 55% increase in the overall price level in Sri Lanka. But at the same time, Sri Lanka's exchange rate, the value of rupee against the US dollar has depreciated by some 80%. And if we convert this 23 trillion GDP to US dollar terms, it comes to about 66 billion US dollars in year 2022, down from 85 billion in year 2021. So there has been a decline of some 19 billion. And as a result, Sri Lanka's per capita gross domestic product, the average income which a person might get, if this entire amount of 66 billion US dollars is distributed among the people of Sri Lanka equally, it has come down from 3,800 US dollars in 2021 to 3,000 US dollars in 2022. So what it means is that we have become poorer. All of us have become poorer on average, but the poverty level has bitten the low-income people much more than the high-income people. That is because there's a very unequal distribution of income in Sri Lanka. The top 20% of income earners get about nearly half of the total income. The lowest 20% gets only 5% of the income. So what has happened is that because of this economic calamity that we are facing, as a result of the economic policy measures that we had undertaken, the lower income people as well as the middle income people have been very badly hit. So we all have become poorer. So now your question was, you know, how did we come to this position? We came to this position mainly because of the economic policy measures that we had undertaken from around, say, year 2010, where we were concentrating on the development of the economy based on the national economic growth, the internal economic growth. So as a result, we didn't pay attention to export sector, which it deserves, and exports were rising in terms of US dollars, but of course, as a percentage of GDP, they were falling. So because of this reason, we had a growing balance of payments deficit. With the growing balance of payment deficit, we had to borrow money in order to build up reserves. And when the reserves were also declining, there was a pressure for exchange rate to depreciate. And on top of that, the government that came to power in 2019 had introduced a very attractive unsolicited tax regime, tax concessions to people. As a result, the government lost revenue to the extent of some 600 billion rupees per annum in 2020, 2021 and 2022 as well. So because of these reasons, we are now where we are today. So that is why Sri Lanka is unable to pay its foreign debt. Sri Lanka is unable to continue with a normal import program to provide essential imports to Sri Lanka, including medicine, fuel, LP gas, raw materials for industries, and so forth. So we are therefore now have been turned to a bigger nation, because we have to now beg for food, beg for medicines, beg for fuel, beg for raw materials from the rest of the world. So this is exactly due to some illogical and unsound economic policies that have been adopted from around, say, year 2010.
Dr. Vijayvardhana, now one of the things is now we have been taking so much of loans. No, I think I saw that in the article, US dollars 80 billion was the amount that we have taken loans. But you know, even a businessman who goes to the bank for a loan, he will have to prepare a feasibility report. He will have to go through it, justify how he is going to carry his business, how he is going to repay it. But was there something different that was happening where the government was concerned without going the normal way? Now, if it is ADB, World Bank, but something else has happened, which has really maybe where, although we were maybe on a higher status, we have been not thinking in a way how we should be able to suitably repay these loans.
Well, this 80 billion US dollar loan portfolio Sri Lanka had been based on the definition of foreign borrowings, which would actually provide some risk to a country made by the International Monetary Fund. In terms of the International Monetary Fund, the borrowings of the government is not necessarily the borrowings by the central government run by the General Treasury. There are several other borrowings affiliated to the public sector that have to be included. Now, those borrowings are the borrowings by the public corporations, including the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, state banks, and also any borrowing done by either the private sector or the public sector on a guarantee from the Treasury should also be considered as a public sector borrowing. So when we add all these, liabilities of Sri Lanka, it comes to some 80 billion, even though the general statistics published by the Ministry of Finance and for the Central Bank of Sri Lanka would talk about some 35 billion loan portfolio. So out of these borrowings, we have not been able to repay because we don't have any foreign exchange. And your question was whether there was any assessment made by Sri Lanka when it contracted these borrowings. The answer is no, because the most of these borrowing that we have made from the multilateral agencies, as well as bilateral countries like EU, Australia, Japan, UK, and USA, there had been some assessment made before the lending had been granted to Sri Lanka. But when it came to borrowing from the commercial sector, commercial market by issuing international sovereign bonds, or borrowing directly from the international banks that would provide loans on a commercial basis, there had not been a sufficient assessment done when the loans had been granted. So what happened was, since the borrowing from the bilateral sources and multilateral sources would normally take time. In my experience, if you start a borrowing process today, it will take at least 3 years for the particular lending agency to grant the lending to the country. So the governments could not wait for 3 years, and therefore they resorted to borrowing from commercial sources, specifically Exim Bank of China, Development Bank of China, international lending sovereign bond markets, and as a result, the borrowing figures had actually swelled beyond what has been reported by the central bank and the Ministry of Finance in their annual reports. Fortunately for us, when the debt restructuring assignment was given to LASAT, the financial advisors to government of Sri Lanka, they had not followed the definition adopted by the central bank and the government. They had followed the definition of the International Monetary Fund, and that is why this 80 billion figure has now been revealed to us.
Just one more question before I hand over to Mr. Hennayaka. Now we were talking of the international sovereign bonds. No? Now these are based on the rating agencies' assessment. Do you think that the rating agencies had really done a proper assessment of Sri Lanka?
Well, they had done because all these borrowings were made by Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka's country rating had been done at say B level. Now B level is a speculative level, and as a result, there's a high risk of repayment of these funds. So that is why Sri Lanka had to pay a premium when it borrowed from the international commercial markets of I would say 5%. And the interest rates, normal interest rate at which we had borrowed was about 7 to 8%. So the rating agencies had done a correct assessment about the Sri Lanka's ability. And when the government of Sri Lanka introduced this tax concession in December 2019, and when it had gone ahead with that program, immediately we were downgraded from B level to CCC level by all the three rating agencies. That is because when the government loses its revenue, there's a high risk of repayment. And as a result, rating agencies had very correctly put Sri Lanka's situation at the correct level. So in my view, there has not been any over-assessment of the lending repayment capacity of Sri Lanka by the rating agencies. They have actually done the job well. What has actually happened is that every time when the rating agencies had downgraded Sri Lanka government as well as the central bank had been trying to find fault with the rating agencies rather than correcting themselves on the basis of the observations by these rating agencies. So that is where we have gone wrong.
Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Hennayaka.
Right. Thank you, Professor. Once again, let me also thank Dr. Vijayawardena for accepting our invitation to be with us at this webinar and to share his knowledge with us on timely important topic. Let me move on to the discussion. Dr. Vijayawardena, in debt restructuring, any creditor will first try to make their case as a special creditor and avoid the restructuring. I think right now we have that evidence. If it fails, the creditors will try to expand the net as much as possible, including domestic creditors, and share the pain with everybody. So if that happens, there will be a huge impact on the banking and financial system in the country and the society at large. So Dr. Vijayawardena, how do we mitigate the risk in the event if they extend it to domestic market, and what would be the impact on the banking sector in Sri Lanka?
Well, so far that issue has not arisen in the case of Sri Lanka, and these creditors have not raised the issue that the government of Sri Lanka is unable to repay its domestic debt. Simply because even though our inflation rate is running at say 70% now, which might go up to another 80% in about 2 to 3 months time period, the Sri Lanka government is still able to print money and repay its domestic debt. And therefore, there's no question of the default of the domestic debt by Sri Lanka. But what happens is that when the inflation rate goes above 100%, Sri Lanka government's ability to print money and repay the debt will become very low. And as a result, by that time, Sri Lanka will have to default its the domestic debt as well. So this particular issue has not so far arisen. But assuming that the international lenders to Sri Lanka are raising this issue, that your domestic debt is also not sustainable, and therefore you will have to come up with a program to restructure your domestic debt. There are various options available to government of Sri Lanka. Because as you have very correctly said, if it happens, for example, if we have to restructure our treasury bonds and treasury bills, it is Sri Lanka's central bank which will be the first casualty of the particular measure, because central bank had been holding about 2.3 trillion worth of treasury bills issued by the government. Then we have the Employees Provident Fund, National Savings Bank, Employees Trust Fund, Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation, commercial banks, People's Bank and Bank of Ceylon, and all these institutions are holding a huge amount of government treasury bills. If there is a restructuring that might call on taking a haircut of say 30% of the principal amount, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka will lose its entire capital, because the losses to Central Bank of Sri Lanka will be around, at the present level of holding of treasury bills, it will be around 700 billion Sri Lanka rupees, and Central Bank's capital position is only about 400 billion Sri Lanka rupees. So Central Bank will become bankrupt before any of the other institutions will become bankrupt. So therefore, the Central Bank is now trying its best. We'll have to give credit to the present management in the Central Bank to raise whatever the money needed by the government of Sri Lanka without printing new money, by allowing the interest rates to go up. And that is why the treasury bill rate had just shot up from 12% about say 4 months ago to 30% today. So Central Bank is trying to raise whatever the amount the government wants from the market, and therefore Central Bank is showing the rest of the world that the domestic debt is not unsustainable. Sri Lanka is still able to raise any amount the government wants by resorting to the market, by allowing the interest rate to go up, and therefore right now we don't have this particular problem. But if the problem arises, probably what would happen is, now I can offer some of the options that we can introduce. One is that we take the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and we take the entire debt portfolio of the Central Bank amounting to 2.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupees out of the Central Bank balance sheet, and we hand it over to a special purpose vehicle. And that special purpose vehicle will have to receive the money being prepaid by the government from time to time. So once you clean the Central Bank's balance sheet, the Central Bank will be able to perform without losing its capital, because this happened in the case of the Central Bank of the Philippines in 1993. The Central Bank of the Philippines became bankrupt, and therefore they had to wind up the existing central bank and set up a new central bank called Banco Filipinas, the BSP, Banco Central NG Filipinas, BSP. And what happened was, in the case of the liabilities of the previous Central Bank of the Philippines, they were handed to a special purpose vehicle, during which they had to collect all the loans of the Central Bank over a period of 25 years and repay the government of Sri Lanka, government of the Philippines annually. So this had happened till about say 2018. So we have experience from other countries where our central bank can also resort handing over the portfolio to someone else, so that someone else will collect that money over the time from the government. But immediately the central bank can clean its balance sheet, and once the central bank's balance sheet is cleaned, I don't think that the creditors will insist that the other institutions should also should receive a haircut from the government.
Dr. Vijayawardena, now the IMF says that a country's public debt should be sustainable. Can you explain what they mean?
The sustainability means that the repayments of the existing debt should be done by the government of the country without resorting to extraordinary measures, or there is no other option available except defaulting the loans. So in the case of the foreign loans of Sri Lanka, we had already reached that position. That is why in April 2022, the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance had jointly announced that in the case of some selected loans from the commercial lenders as well as from the bilateral lenders, the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance will not repay the loan installments, and instead they would suspend it. But in the case of the domestic debt, as I have mentioned here, that we have not come to that position because the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has been able to raise whatever the money that is needed to repay the existing domestic debt by borrowing from the market and without going for these extraordinary measures. So in the case of domestic debt, we don't have that problem. But in the case of foreign debt, yes, we have the problem.
Now the EFF, now the IMF, what they're going to give us is only US dollars 2.9 billion over a period of 4 years. So what is the plan that we are going to have in order to maybe restructure our economy and also to repay the debts that we are going to have?
That is a different program which government of Sri Lanka will have to adopt, because the money that is being given to Sri Lanka by IMF by of this extended fund facility, which can be drawn by Sri Lanka over 4-year time period in half-yearly installments. Any particular installment will be about say 370 million US dollars. So that is a peanut given the basic requirements of the country with respect to foreign exchange. So as a result, we have two problems. One is the immediate problem of meeting our foreign exchange requirements. For that purpose, once we get the certificate from the IMF, we would be able to get additional funding from the World Bank and the ADB, amount to about 2 billion US dollars. Then there are some federal countries like Japan, which would also come to Sri Lanka's help, which would also provide some funding. So we would be able to maintain a minimum level of import program until such time we would be able to develop our economy. Now, the development of the economy is a different issue. For that purpose, the government of Sri Lanka will have to introduce a medium to long-term strategy to, as you have very correctly mentioned, deregulate the economy first, then make the business easier. Then we have to join the global markets seamlessly and increase the exportation of goods and services and earn foreign exchange and make Sri Lanka friendly for investors to come and invest. And all these may require Sri Lanka to adopt, high technology, develop the technological base. So these are actually different plans which the government of Sri Lanka will have to implement other than the money that we get from the EFF. So in the past, we had gone to IMF on 16 occasions, and many people are asking why Sri Lanka was not able to get the my camera was just off. Let me.
Yeah, okay. No, we can hear you. Continue. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So Sri Lanka was not able to get any worthwhile facility from the IMF. The main reason is that we had just depended on getting this money from the IMF without concentrating on introducing an equally suitable development plan for Sri Lanka. So this is one of the problems that we are facing today. So we will have to, in fact, now if I come back to this economic growth level, Professor Wattawala, since in 2022, our economy has shrunk to 66 billion US dollars. We had moved back to the level of our economy which we had in year 2011. So we had moved backward by say 11 years. So we cannot expect to live with the same lifestyle that we are living today, because all of us have become poorer, and the money that would be given to us by the international lenders would be sufficient only to maintain a minimum import program. So each one of us will have to cut down our consumption and save money, and also change our lifestyle so that it would be actually fitting the current level of the economic activities of Sri Lanka. So these are challenging things which the government of Sri Lanka has to introduce today.
They say it is no longer an economic issue, but a geopolitical issue. Can you maybe explain that to us?
Yeah, if it is an economic issue, of course, by getting this IMF money and also by introducing an alternative development strategy by the government, we will be able to resolve the issue. But this debt restructuring has become a geopolitical issue because of the intransigence of China. Usually, when the debt is restructured, the Western world would normally go for a haircut, which is actually a reduction of the principal amount that we have to pay or the interest that you have to pay by a certain percentage. Now, the usual percentages applied by many countries which have done this restructuring programs is about 30 to 40% of the principal amount. Now, China doesn't want to go for this because China has already lent about 1.35 trillion of US dollars to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And it's about, say, 65% of that lending that it has done, it has been estimated, they are about to default. So what happens is that if China agrees with this kind of a debt restructuring involving a haircut, China will have to extend the same facility to other countries also. So China doesn't want to do that. So instead, what China is proposing is China would elongate the repayment period, or China will give us a new loan so that we will be able to repay the existing loan. And there will be a new loan in our loan book, and we have to now contribute that. But that doesn't reduce the debt liability of a country. In fact, what would happen is it actually keeps the country indebted. So what happens is now China is reluctant to come and provide this facility to us. And these are being discussed in an informal environment where the commercial lenders would meet in London, which we call the London Club, and the other bilateral lenders would meet in Paris, which we call the Paris Club. And China is not a member of either the London Club or the Paris Club. So we'll have to get China on board. Without getting China on board, we will not be able to introduce the debt restructuring plan. So that actually is a geopolitical issue, because on one side, there is China. On the other side, we have the Western world. In the middle, we have India. So Sri Lanka government will have to employ its capacity to manage the geopolitical issues amicably in order to get China on board. And that is why it has become a geopolitical issue rather than an economic issue today.
Over to you, Mr. Hennayak.
Right. This question is based on the kind of explanation given by Dr. Vijayawardena. As we have mentioned that we have gone to the central bank 16 signing, I think if you quantify, maybe we have been with IMF program for more than 28 years. So in the past, we agreed with them certain targets, but hardly achieved them. That was one of the reasons as to why we failed to introduce proper economic reforms in the past. So this is my personal view. So Dr. Vijayawardena, if it happens this time too, along with current economic crisis as well as the debt restructuring program, where will we end up?
Well, you have a reasonable, expectation of the previous failures being repeated in the current one also, because the Sri Lanka government has not been sincere. Out of the 16 loans that we had got from IMF, we had been able to complete only 9 of that, and the 7 of that had been, aborted by the government in midway. Even the most recent standby arrangement, which government got in year 2016, was aborted by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration in year 2020. And as a result, our past track record is not creditable. So as a result, if the government of Sri Lanka would abort the program, which it agrees with IMF to introduce the necessary reforms, midway through the extended fund facility program, then of course that will be a disaster for the country. Because unlike on previous occasions, this time we don't have foreign exchange available. We have 2 critical risk factors here. One is that our treasury is overdrawn, the consolidated fund of the Minister of Finance, which is the one which keeps the money that comes into the government, has been overdrawn to the extent of 1 trillion Sri Lanka rupees based on an overdraft facility which they had got from the Central Bank, Bank of Ceylon, and People's Bank. And at the same time, the central bank's foreign reserves are negative to the extent of 4.7 billion US dollars. So on both counts, we have no any luxury of aborting these programs. So instead, we will have to go through it, whatever the objections, whatever the hardships that Sri Lankan people will have to face, in order to realize the concrete results that are envisaged in the program.
Doctor, now, debt restructuring without making structural economic reforms may lead the way for another restructuring of debt if it is not done successfully. The reason being that this is the first time that we had to do it, or rather, we do not have the right expertise to do it. That is why we are depending on the foreign expert. The consequences of this will lead to slowdown of economic activities and growth, instability in the finance system, and many other economic problems. So, Dr. Vichavardhan, do you think that policymakers are fully aware of this situation, or are they ignorant on it?
Well, of course, as far as my former colleagues of the central bank are concerned, they are fully aware, and they have given the correct advice to the government. At the same time, the Minister of Finance, now being headed by another former colleague of mine, he is also fully aware of the consequences. So he also might give the correct advice to the Minister of Finance. But what happens is, outside the central bank and outside the Ministry of Finance, there are these government parliamentarians who are not fully aware of the consequences of aborting an IMF program midway through, and how we would be facing the situation, the catastrophe that might come on Sri Lanka as a result of that. Now, I can, for your information, I can just, visualize the type of catastrophe. Now, we don't have any foreign exchange to continue with the minimum import program needed by Sri Lanka. And as a result, even the new foreign exchange that we earn by, improving our exports and also improving the tourism sector, that will not be sufficient for us to meet. So what happens is that we'll have to curtail most of the imported product that we are consuming today, but at the same time, we will have to give up the consumption of the most essential items like medicine, then fuel, cooking gas, and also raw materials for industries. So there will be a situation where the government will have to allocate the existing available foreign exchange among these competing ends, and there will be queues again for foreign exchange in the first place, and then for the limited quantity of goods that we import in the second place. So it is just like it's driving so much of corruption inside the Sri Lanka economy, and when the country is hit by this corruption level, there is incentive for people not to work hard and earn their money, but to engage in these extra market activities and make some money, which we call rent seeking. And it happened to Sri Lanka before 1978, when we had this, control regime. Lots of people didn't want to engage themselves in productive economic activity, but they were simply living on the corrupt system there. So same thing will happen. So what happens is that Sri Lanka will become poorer and poorer. Presently, our GDP is about, say, 66 billion US dollars. It will come down. So most probably we will move backward in our economic in economic development, and probably end up even before we got independence from the British in 1948. So that is the consequence of ignoring the ground realities that we are facing today.
Dr. Vijayavardhan, now they have our total debt as at August 2022 is $80 billion. But whereas the government is planning to restructure only $33 billion. Can you explain as to what is really happening?
I think the initial choice had been that because on the 12th of April 2022, when the Minister of Finance made the announcement that it would be suspended the repayment of debt, they have covered only the debt that you have just mentioned. That is the commercial debt plus the borrowing from the bilateral sources. But in addition to that, there are these other borrowings made by Sri Lanka, and unfortunately for us, we don't have any foreign exchange to service that debt either. So what happens is that the entire of the debt portfolio of Sri Lanka will be defaulted by the country, and if it happens, it is again a catastrophic for Sri Lanka. So even if we restructure the existing ones amounting to this 33 billion US dollars, it is not sufficient for Sri Lanka to get out of the woods. So that is why I think Central Bank Governor Dantalal Veerasinghe very correctly, he had said that we are still not out of the woods in one of these seminars in Colombo recently. So this is a very serious situation.
Now, looking at, we really need foreign exchange. So one of the things that they are looking at is the foreign direct investment. And of course, to do this, you also need the political stability. Do you think that this would be some ideal maybe method by which we might be able to get foreign exchange to the country to repay some of these loans by foreign direct investment?
Yeah, foreign direct investments is actually the ideal source of foreign exchange inflows to the country because it doesn't add to the debt portfolio of the country. But for us to get the worthwhile foreign direct investment, I qualify it as saying worthwhile foreign direct investments involving high technology. We must have the political stability, number one, the consistency in economic policy, number two, continuation of the same policy over a period of time, number three, and all these things will have to be set up by Sri Lanka. But the present administration, it seems, is not going behind this type of groundwork, and instead it's trying to maintain its power base by getting the support from whoever would be giving the support to the government. And as a result, we are losing the prospect of getting worthwhile foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka, and which is also a problem. And I hope that it will be realized by the government in power, and they would introduce the necessary things. So that's why central bank had been telling again and again, the political stability is a must for Sri Lanka to get out of this current problem.
Now, there are certain conditions laid down by the IMF. No? One, of course, is that we should have sufficient revenue, and of course, they are now increasing the taxes. But at the same time, they will have to control the expenses of the government. One thing is, of course, maybe the most of the budget is all going for government expenditure. How do you think that the IMF conditions will be in order to cut down the government expenditure?
Well, as you have said, one of the conditions for the EFF is that Sri Lanka will have to have a surplus in its primary account of the budget by year 2025, amounting to 2% of GDP. So what we mean by primary account is that if we take the total expenditure of the government, we exclude the interest payments, and then we compare it with the total revenue of the government. So the surplus or deficit that is called the primary account, and we had been having a deficit in the primary account because of the heavy expenditure, non-interest involving heavy expenditure by the government. So in order to meet this target of 2% surplus in primary account in year 2025, there are two things that the government has to do. Number one, government has to increase its revenue, which it already has started. Number two is the most crucial thing, cut down all the unnecessary expenditure that would matter for the government of Sri Lanka. In other words, since we have now gone back to the economic level of year 2011 right now, we cannot have the same lifestyle today as which we are enjoying. We have to cut down everything the government's side, and in my view, even the appointment of new ministers and state ministers had gone against this particular objective of the government. So what the government should have done is, because since we are engaged in a war now, so at a time of war, we cannot have as many ministers as possible. We must have a war council, maybe 5 or 6 ministers headed by the President of the Republic. They could have manage and run the entire country until such time we would have got out of the woods. So this is a serious issue, as you say. If we fail to meet this particular target of 2% surplus in our primary account in 2025, we will not be able to draw any money from IMF after that. So the entire EFF will be aborted midway through, as we had done in the past.
Dr. Jayawardena, what do you think could be the role of the private sector? Because you see now the private sector is doing the exports, so many things. But unfortunately, because of this bad management in government, they are badly affected. So how do you think that the private sector can really activate and maybe assist the government in all these activities?
Well, in fact, in my view, private sector should not assist the government. Private sector assist itself. Because the private sector is very badly affected, because you would have noted their borrowing from the banking sector has gone down in July. Therefore, they have not been able to access the required amount of credit facilities for the banking sector. But taking into account the current risk that it faces, as well as the problems that it is facing, the private sector will have to do it on its own without depending on the government, because as we have observed in the past, Sri Lanka government is not in a position to support the private sector, because private sector will have to introduce technology, private sector will have to find markets outside Sri Lanka, private sector will have to have these linkages with the rest of the economy, because big private sector firms can have linkages with SMEs, and so that the SMEs will produce the exportable products for the private sector. So that kind of a reform program should be undertaken by the private sector without any support from the government. Don't expect the government to give any support to the private sector. Also don't expect that the private sector can support the government. What should be done is private sector will have to work thinking that there is no government in Sri Lanka.
Actually, when I said to help the government, that is really to how the private sector can generate the foreign exchange. You see, like what you said, it's exports and other activities which will really, so that even without the government, the whole country can run, So I think you also gave a very important message that the private sector should now take over this all these operations and try to run this country. Is that correct?
Exactly, you're correct, because we have examples I don't want to mention the names here. There are some firms which had been able to penetrate the global market by using high technology and supplying some components of a major product which can be used for assembling a final product in another country. So there are several firms which are doing it right now. And as it is, because they never got any support from the government. In fact, I had been told by the CEOs of all these firms that they ran into problems with the government when they started the business. So best thing which the government can do is, leave the private sector alone and let the private sector take over initiative and also find the markets, get the technology and produce and supply and get the foreign exchange. And as but one most important thing, Professor Watawala, is, as you have very correctly mentioned, if there are too much of regulations that would affect the operation of the private sector, then of course we are introducing a kind of obstacles for the private sector to operate freely.
Thank you. Mr. Hennaik, over to you.
Yeah, Professor. I think Professor Watawala mentioned about the taxation. Dr. Vijayawardena, to increase the revenue, there are some changes to the existing tax policies in the recent past by way of the budget proposal. So given the current situation, we must admit the fact that most of the businesses in several industries will not be able to perform well, and the result is that there will be an adverse impact on the bottom line with respect of the size and nature of the business. More importantly, it is a well accepted norm that taxes to be increased in line with the GDP growth of a country. So my question is, going forward, what would be the strategy to be followed by the government to fill the revenue gap?
Right now, Sri Lanka government has no any choice because Sri Lanka government had already destroyed its tax base by introducing this tax concession in 2019. Now, what is being done by the government is correcting the past mistakes. But the mistakes are being corrected at a time when the economy is shrinking rather than growing. So we have a shrinking economy, and the central bank is expecting the negative economic growth in year 2023 also, but after 2024, the bank is expecting a positive economic growth of about say 2 to 3% after that. But that is not sufficient for the government of Sri Lanka to build up its reserve base. So most important thing which the government should do is, instead of trying to tax the people and get this money, it has to cut down its expenditure. It has to shrink itself, just like the economy has shrunk now. And therefore, there must be a massive cost minimization program to be adopted by the government, which we call the austerity measures, and in layman's language, it's called the belt tightening. So belt tightening should be done by the president downwards. The president himself will have to tighten his belt, then his cabinet ministers, then the parliamentarians, then all the senior government officers, then all the party men. Then they have to invite the people at large to tighten their belt. So this is just like a country has been hit by an atomic bomb. Immediately after the Second World War in Japan, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan also faced a similar situation. So we are also facing the same situation, even though there has not been an atomic bomb dropped on us. The political bomb has been dropped on us. So the government will have to cut down itself and adopt these austerity measures to an extreme in order to manage with the existing revenue rather than increasing the revenue.
Doctor, let me ask the question from the point of view of the central bank. Again, given the current economic situation, why can't the Central Bank of Sri Lanka prepare a national credit plan and allocate the funds for the priority sector in consultation with or directing the banking system and introduce credit ceiling to support the issues faced by the various industries? Any comment?
Well, it's an option because we did it in 1982 when Governor Baransen Rasaputra was the governor of the central bank. We were facing a similar situation, but not to the extent of gravity that we are facing today. Because the maximum inflation rate even in 1981-82 was about 25 to 26%, not 75 to 80% as we are experiencing today. So what we did was, when the central bank adopted this restrictive monetary policy, the amount of credit which the banking sector can lend had been limited by the monetary policy action taken by the central bank. So that was allocated among the banking sector, individual banks, and among the individual banks also around the private sectors. So this credit plan was in operation from 1982 to 85, and after 85 it was abandoned because the central bank felt that there was no necessity. But I think, Mr. Yannaga Bandara, it's good time for central bank to rethink of introducing such a scheme today.
Thank you. Professor,
Yeah.
over to you.
Yeah, there is a question now that we are talking about the central bank. The CBSL is now borrowing heavily with very high rates. Will they be able to repay interest capital, even local debt in the future?
Well, that's a big issue because whatever the money, of course, we have to keep in our mind that the government of Sri Lanka had been repaying its domestic debt by recycling the debt in the past. Ever since we became independent in 1940, that was the practice we had adopted. And we were able to borrow from the market in order to make these payments. But as this questioner had very correctly raised the issue, we have now come to a situation where the economy is shrinking. Therefore, people don't have income. Each one of us has now become poorer. And central bank is adopting a very restrictive monetary policy to fight the inflation. And therefore, they don't have enough money available. And as a result, even with the high interest rates, we will come to a situation where the government will not be able to repay this money. And the only option then available would be to print money and repay, which in terms of the IMF definition is non-sustainable with the domestic debt.
There is also another question. What will happen to deposit holders if government default or cut government securities held by the bank and foreign investors?
Well, of course, each one of us will have to lose our deposit, because what happens is that, you know, if there is a haircut on the domestic investment that they have made in treasury bills and treasury bonds, none of the commercial banks or the National Savings Bank would be able to maintain its capital ratios. So they become bankrupt, and once they become bankrupt, we have to lose that money. So that is why the central bank is trying very hard today to avoid that situation. But if there is, you know, such pressure coming to the central bank to restructure domestic debt, I think it is better for the central bank to consider only the restrictions imposed on the central bank by handing over its debt portfolio to a special purpose vehicle and clean its balance sheet, and then satisfy the foreign creditors. But you know, these questions would actually tell us the direction to which, you know, we are going now. So we have to take it very seriously, and we have to find solutions for all these issues that the people are raising, because people have the fear that they might lose their deposit because the bank will become bankrupt. So Sri Lanka will have to avoid any possibility of, you know, the banking sector becoming bankrupt.
There is another question on IMF conditions, whether what these conditions are.
Well, IMF conditions are all in public domain today. One is that central bank should be made independent, and the Prime Minister and President and Minister of Finance, in his interim budget, he announced that he will take action to make central bank independent. Then IMF wants the government to increase its revenue. The government has already taken some measures to increase revenue. Third one, IMF wants the government to cut down its non-interest expenditure. Government has so far not, you know, addressed that issue. The fourth, the IMF wants the central bank not to print money and lend to government. The central bank has already started this. In the last maybe 5 or 6 treasury bill auctions, the central bank minimized its involvement in the in funding, providing funding to the government. Even the treasury bill auction that was held day before yesterday, central bank had been able to get out of 85 billion, 81 billion from the market. Only 4 billion had been printed by central bank. And the next one is that the government state-owned enterprises should be converted to profit-making enterprises by restructuring them. Then the debt restructuring should be there. So all these are in public domain, and they are not secrets anymore.
Dr. Vijayawardhan, I was really trying to see how we are going to repay these debts. Now we are saying US dollars 80 billion. No? Yeah. So if we repay US dollars 2 billion per annum, only the capital, it will take 40 years without interest payment. Now, in your view, how long do you think that we will have to struggle to repay these loans?
No, we cannot unless we get some, facility from some other country. But, none of these countries would extend any facility to Sri Lanka in order to repay the exited debt. So it is just for the as a support to the people of Sri Lanka and not the creditors of Sri Lanka. So we are in a big soup today.
Over to you, Mr. Hennayake.
Yeah. Doctor, it is a kind of follow-up question based on the question asked by Professor Bhattawala. Now, you would agree with us that debt restructuring is not the only solution to address the current economic crisis, because it is only a fraction of US dollars 80 billion, as both of you have mentioned. In fact, these news to all of us in the past, we were talking about roughly about 52 to 57 billion, but now, as you said, based on the definition of the World Bank, now they have arrived at 80 billion. Therefore, the government should have a master plan to increase the revenue medium to long period of time. So if I take my personal experience, when I went before the COP as a CFO of the bank at that time, they always ask us to prepare a 10-year strategic business plan, or other corporate plan, whatever you call it, in the same document. But I'm wondering whether the government is having the master plan to increase the revenue in medium to long period. So do you think that the policymakers are concentrating on the major economic reforms to be undertaken on an urgent basis?
Well, you are perfectly correct, because government is presently, firefighting. So we have the current economic, crisis. So government is trying to address that crisis and ignored the need for introducing a longer term development plan. And we need a longer term development plan, because the President and Finance Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, in his interim budget speech, he had very clearly announced that Sri Lanka will have to become a rich country by year 2048, when it celebrates its centenary celebration of independence from the British. And as a result, we need this, 25 to 30-year long development plan to deliver that particular objective to Sri Lanka. For that purpose, we cannot have a 25-year plan immediately. We must at least have a 10-year roadmap, as was done by Vietnam in year 2019, when Vietnam faced the situation where Vietnam has to join the fourth industrial revolution in order to promote its export to the rest of the world. It introduced a roadmap in year 2019 to convert the Vietnam's economy to the fourth industrial revolution by year 2030. A similar roadmap has to be developed and introduced by the government, and it has to get the support of all the political parties to that, because once if this government fails and another government will come to power, they will have to continue with that particular policy. So it's a must today. Without that, I don't think we will be able to rescue Sri Lanka.
Dr. Vijayavardhan, I think one of the other things we have mentioned in this debt restructuring plan is the impact on society. Now, if you really look at it, the society is badly affected. Now, one is thing that is today malnutrition. Now they are saying malnutrition, and the FAO and others are coming to help us. Then the medical facilities, the shortage of fuel, power cuts, then the prices, everyday prices are going up, food shortages and many others, and poverty is increasing. So then also at the same time, the skilled people are leaving the country. Others are going for education. So I think we are in a very, very difficult situation. How do you think that we will be able to support Sri Lanka? Do you think that foreigners will come, or foreign countries will come and help to overcome this problem?
Yeah, I think you had very correctly drawn our attention to the onset of this humanitarian crisis we are headed towards today. Because this was actually foreseen by us about, say, 5 to 6 months ago. And we found that the agricultural production was falling, declining, and we have a food shortage immediately. So we are here, but the rest of the world can only provide a marginal support to Sri Lanka, because they cannot take over the entirety of the burden from Sri Lanka. So there we have to stand on our own feet today. So that is why I said the private sector will have to stand its own feet. Yeah, each one of us as citizens of Sri Lanka will have to stand on our own feet, and we'll have to find ways of meeting these requirements, the food requirements and various other requirements that we have, by producing more and also by engaging in more economic activities. So this is something that had not been foreseen by the policymakers. Now, you'd have noted that when the UNICEF drew the attention of the government of Sri Lanka about the rising incidence of malnutrition among the children of Sri Lanka, immediately the relevant ministers stood up in parliament and they denied it. They said there is no such a thing, whereas we find every day the people who are, the children with, malnutrition. We find every day.
Right. Okay. There is actually, we have one of our council members, Mr. JPR Karunaratna, who's in the central bank. He's the assistant governor there. Mr. Karunaratna, do you have any comments to make? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and also let me thank Vijay further for wonderful, explanation given to all the questions. So let me put in this way. So given that, question of domestic debt restructuring, what do you think that whether our bank should take serious note of that and make any plans for such, if such restructuring is needed by now itself?
Well, this forward planning is a must, Karu, because as it seems that the central bank will not be able to get the entirety of the funding requirements of the government from the market, even with these high interest rates, because we find that a certain amount of money has to be printed by the central bank. And once the central bank is unable to do so, our domestic debt also becomes unsustainable. And at that point, every banking institution, every financial institution will have to suffer. So therefore, they will have to have a pre-plan today how they should address it. One is that they should immediately look at their cash flow, improve the cash flow. If there are non-performing assets in the banks, they will have to address the issue and get the money out of the non-performing assets and improve the cash flow, and also build up the reserves in the bank and also the capital base of the bank in order to meet this. But however, we'll have to warn that if there's a massive debt restructuring is needed in the case of the domestic debt, none of the banks, including the central bank, can survive the tsunami. It's like a tsunami.
There is a question, Dr. Vijayawardena. How long will it take the economy to normalize, say 2019 status, after all this debt restructuring, IMF programs happening? What should policymakers should do? Any sequence of actions they should take from now on? That's the question. I don't know whether you got it or...
Yeah, in fact, the central bank, when it made the presentation to creditors, it had said that the negative economic growth will become positive by year 2025. But of course, the economic growth will remain around 2 to 3% till about 2027. Now, 2 to 3% annual economic growth is not the normalization of the Sri Lanka's economic situation. We must have 7% plus. So in my view, in order to reach that level, 7% plus continuous economic growth, it might take another 10-year time period, provided we would introduce the necessary economic reforms and economic development strategy to come out of the present issue. If without that, and if we just concentrate on the current economic crisis, we are actually losing time.
Right. There is one of another banker, Mr. Bandara Rakogama. Bandara Rakogama, you can speak now. Can you speak?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah. Your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And I think I was listening to at the outset our Dr. Vijayawardena mentioned about what's the benefit from this green light from the IMF, and thereafter other benefits. I mean, with the other donor funders, they are very positively looking at.
Congratulations, Ayya, to you and your wife.
Yeah.
Great to see this.
Yeah, my question is, now we think the situation will normalize if the country, like even politically, if normalized. Now thing is, the SME and other sectors are struggling to come out with the other crises, like though they are independently working, but the infrastructure like fuel and power supply, continuous power supply, that's the main issue. So that segment we have to look after. If they work as their own silos, but still we have to get some facilities from the government. That's the main issue for even for manufacturing and the transportation as well. What will be the government point of view to support this sector in your point of view, doctor?
Well, thank you very much for raising that issue. But given the fact that the Sri Lanka government is bankrupt and it is not in a position to pay even the salaries to public servants, there is no any cushion that the government can extend to SMEs. But what we should do is that, since we were talking about the role of the private sector, the large public private corporations, what we should do is we must build up this backward linkages with the SMEs. So that can be done by the chambers and also the various private sector associations. They can link themselves to the SMEs, and also if the situation requires them to provide technology to them, provide technology, get them to produce, and those products can be exported to rest of the world. So this is one of the things that we can do. But apart from that, in my view, Sri Lanka government is not in a position to help anyone, including the government itself.
Thank you. Mr. Kosal
Dr.
Dissanayake, you have
sorry.
any questions or sorry? Okay, Mr. Hennage, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, Doctor, this is a accountability question. I don't know whether it is appropriate to ask this question. Many economists, including you, raised the concern on the sustainability of debts just after COVID-19. Very clearly, many of them recommended economic reforms to avoid any debt restructuring. International rating agencies also alerted on the same, and many policymakers denied it or silence about these alerts. So, Dr. Vijayawardena, from the point of view of accountability, is it possible to take any action against the officers who are responsible for the economic crime committed by them?
Yes, of course, we can take action against the officers who had been accountable for that. And of course, there are 4 cases before the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka raising this particular issue, and the cases are being heard by the Supreme Court. And I hope that the Supreme Court will deliver its judgment soon on this point.
Dr. Vijayawardena, on the economic, now this UN has also made certain decisions on this economic crimes. Would you be able to speak a little on that, on this, what the UN is stating about the economic crimes?
Yeah, of course, that's the first time the United Nations Human Rights Council had expanded its mandate to cover the economic crimes as well. But of course, they have the mandate, because when you say about the human rights, the right to employment, right to income, and right to have a livelihood is also part of the human rights of a person. So in Sri Lanka, that had been violated according to the UN Human Rights Council, and that had been something which the local activists had also been demanding from the government of Sri Lanka. And if you look at the demands made by the people who came to Goldface, who are now known as the Argale people, they were also demanding that. So this is the first time in the history of Sri Lanka, as well as in the history of the UN Human Rights Council, the economic crimes had been added to as a part of the human rights of a person, because it's a human right, because right to human right include the right to living and right to livelihood.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Hennage, any last question you have?
Dr. Vijayawardena, now if you take the bilateral facilities, China is holding, I think, roughly about 52%, if I'm not mistaken. So these are, since this is the last question, I thought that ask this question differently. Hopefully next month there will be a new prime minister in China.
Yeah.
So that may be one of the reasons as to why our President Honorable Vikram Singh wanted to defer the discussion with China until the new prime minister is appointed. Any comments?
Well, of course, you are perfectly correct, because the President and Finance Minister Vikram Singh had already said that the negotiations with China are taking place at a low level. Low level means at the official level of the central bank, at the Ministry of Finance on the Sri Lankan side, and the officials in the Republic of China, People's Republic of China on the China side. They have not been upgraded to the level of the head of the state. Now, that would happen after the 10th of October when the Chinese Communist Party will elect the new president of China, and Sri Lanka government will have to start negotiating with the new Chinese administration. So that is why I, at the initial point, I said that this is an acid test for the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration to prove its diplomatic competence. If it fails, we all fail.
Thank you. Rujira, you like to read that last question from Parag Vijay Singh?
Professor, I think he's asking in that question. It's a long question. Basically, the person
I
is
think
asking.
you can read it so that.
Given the current economic situation, the context of the present businesses system, which means nature, structure, some of the businesses they have been involved, should be changed in order to focus in inflow of foreign currency to the country. This may be a very crucial decision Sri Lanka has to take. That is, instead of businesses which promote domestic consumption, should be focused to convert them into export-oriented value-adding businesses or to encourage new export-oriented businesses. So I think basically he's asking about the nature of the businesses that we have to promote.
Exactly, I agree with him because this is something which I had been writing from year 2010 when I started my weekly column on in the Daily FT. In every public forum, I had spoken about it, and even the current president and financier Ranil Wickremesinghe had emphasized on this fact in his address to Parliament a month ago, and also in his interim budget presented in early September. And so there is no any question about it. We have to change the focus of our business. We have to remember this fact. Every dollar is worth to us today more than the 360 rupees which the central bank is asking the banks to pay us. So we must think of that. Every dollar is worth.
How do you think that we can, you see, now we have lost the foreign income from the people who are working overseas. No? What do you think that we should do to regain the same money coming into Sri Lanka?
Well, that will happen after we have introduced the necessary economic reforms, and we are able to build confidence among the people. And but one thing we have to keep in our mind is, instead of trying to eliminate the unofficial money transfer channels like Undial and Hawala, our banks will have to imitate them. Our banks have to imitate them, and then only we will be able to take the market away from them. Otherwise, just trying to eliminate them by laws or by legal action will not help any one of us.
When you
Doctor,
say
there is one more question.
1 minute, when you say imitate, are you saying that they should pay a higher rate or they should do more marketing?
Okay, I will explain this way now. I have been examining this factor. Now, suppose there's a worker in somewhere in one of these Middle Eastern countries. He's visited by an agent of Hawala. And then, they get into an agreement with him at that day because it cuts down the transaction cost to the person who has to remit money. Then the money is collected from him then and there, and that money is handed over to his relatives in Sri Lanka at their doorsteps. And the amount that they actually, the Hawala and Undial system doesn't charge any commission for the service. Whereas because they live on the profits, the buying price and the selling price. But in our case, our commercial banks, in addition to the profit level, they buy at a lower price and sell at a higher price. They actually charge a commission also on the customer. So those things have to be eliminated. You have to go and see the person in the field, get the money, and then deliver the money, safely to their relatives here. So that is the type of, business type imitation that we have to do.
I think that is quite correct, because I think if right sort of action is taken, but I think the government also need to support them so that this could be obtained, because that would be one of the easiest ways that we can get the foreign exchange to this country. So thank you very much, Dr. Vijayawardena. I think it was a very, very interesting and also very informative, and you were also able to clarify many of the matters that were taken up. Now, our theme was challenges beyond the debt restructuring plan and impact on society. So before we really officially pay our thanks and appreciation to you, what is your final takeaway on this whole thing?
Well, in my view, the present debt restructuring plan is not sufficient for Sri Lanka to get out of the current economic crisis, because it just covers only a very small segment of the total foreign debt of Sri Lanka. Second one is central bank will have to do its utmost to avoid a domestic debt restructuring situation, because if it happens, as Mr. Hernayaka had mentioned, it will kill the entire financial system as well as all the savers of the country. So we have to avoid that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vijayavardhana. Ruchiri, you have any comments you like to make? Or?
Professor, there is one more question I would like to ask.
No, I think now we have finished here. Yeah, now we finished here.
No, Professor, no.
Right. Dr. Vijayavardhana, so as I said earlier, we are very thankful to you, because I know that when I rang you, you readily accepted. And, as professional accountants, we have really one problem, I know. You see, the way how the economists calculate reserves and how accountants calculate the reserves. Because I think it's a cash flow system that is operating. But in our case, the reserves are real, true reserves. Otherwise, no company can have a reserve unless there is a surplus. But I think in the case of the economists and the central bank, we always talk of reserves, but it may be, if you really work it out, it may be a negative impact. So maybe since I have said this, Dr. Vijay, I think you can just give a short comment on that.
Well, yeah, I think there shouldn't be any difference between how the reserves are calculated by the private sector accountants and the economics, because both economics and accountancy are interrelated subjects. So what we look at in economics is simply we try to see beyond the numbers which the accountants have produced. But of course, everybody knows now you have the new subject called finance now. When it comes to finance, the job of the experts in finance is to see beyond the numbers that have been produced by the accountants. So in that sense, I think the two subjects converge with each other. So there cannot be any difference between the two.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayavardhana. So as I said, I must thank you for making your valuable time available, because this is not the first time that you have been with the CMA, and we are very proud to have you with us. And I'm sure that all our participants, actually I must tell you that there were over 400 who registered, but you know that in the evenings with these power cuts and other things, we find that a lot of them are unable to come. But certainly we will arrange to send the recording to them, so that at least they will have the ability to listen to what you have said. So once again, let me thank you, Dr. Vijayavardhana, and we do hope to continue this dialogue to you. And as we discussed at the last one, I think the economists and the accountants, chartered accountants, management accountants, or financial accountants, all should get together to put this country and to revive the economy of this country, to help in the restructuring and all these areas. And I feel that the government should make use of not only the professionals, but the private sector. If they don't do that, they are going to make a big mistake, as it has happened now. So at least now, I think they should really make use of them and get their support, so that everyone will support to get this country out of this current situation as early as possible. And I'm sure that the international lending agencies will give a bigger support to the government sector if they get the private sector and the professionals involved. So let me thank everyone, our Vice President, Mr. Hernayaka Bandara, who was also helping in the moderation, Mr. Ruchira Pereira, then also our other council members, Mr. Karuna Ratna, our CEO, Mr. Kosala Disanayaka, and all others who have helped us, and all our participants for logging in and listening to it. And also those who could not attend, we will send you the recording so that you can listen to it and maybe enrich yourself and get more knowledge on the real situation in this country. So thank you very much, and wish you all a very good night.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayawardena. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You will stay, Nayaka. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks.